A boarding pass, Toronto to Vancouver. Departing this Friday. I found it tucked inside my husband's coat pocket when I was bringing his jacket down to the dry cleaner. He told me he had a conference in Ottawa. I stood there in our front hallway for a long time, the coat still in my hands, the boarding pass face up on the little table by the door. The grandfather clock ticked. The house was quiet, the way it only gets when something has just changed and you haven't caught up to it yet. My husband, Douglas, was retiring after 37 years as a senior partner at a civil engineering firm in Halifax. The retirement gala, his firm's word, not mine, was being held that Saturday at the Westin on Hollis Street. His colleagues had planned it for months. I knew this because his assistant, a kind young woman who sometimes called the house, had accidentally mentioned it to me back in September. Douglas had always kept his work life somewhat separate from our home life. I'd accepted that years ago. He said spouses weren't invited this time. A firm decision, he told me. Management wanted it to be colleagues only, to keep things professional and intimate in equal measure. I'd nodded and said of course I understood, but Ottawa. He'd told me Ottawa. I set the boarding pass back exactly where I'd found it. I brought the coat to the dry cleaner. I smiled at the woman behind the counter and said yes, just the usual press, nothing special. I drove home. I sat at the kitchen table and I drank my tea and I thought about 38 years of marriage and what they add up to. I thought about our daughter's wedding, where Douglas had cried openly and held my hand the entire reception. I thought about the summer he was diagnosed with a kidney stone and wouldn't let anyone drive him but me. I thought about how he still reaches for me in the night sometimes, just to check that I'm there. And then I thought about that boarding pass again. I am 63 years old. I spent 20 years as an office administrator at a school board. I know how to manage a spreadsheet. I know how to organise a complex event. And I know with absolute certainty how to be invisible when I need to be. So that Friday morning, after Douglas left for what he said was an early meeting, I drove myself to the airport and I booked a same-day ticket on points. I had enough Aeroplan miles saved up from a trip our daughter had helped me apply for 2 years ago. I packed one carry-on bag. I brought sensible shoes. I did not tell Douglas. I landed in Vancouver at 2 in the afternoon. The city was grey and soft with rain, the mountains hidden somewhere behind the clouds. I'd stayed in Vancouver exactly once before, in 1998, when Douglas and I had driven the kids down the sea to sky and eaten fish and chips on the wharf. I still remembered the smell of that day. Salt and cedar and something frying. I checked into a small hotel on Bird Street. Nothing fancy, a place that allowed same-day bookings without too many questions. I sat on the edge of the bed and I opened my laptop, and I found the Instagram page for Douglas's firm. They had tagged the venue for the gala, the Fairmont Pacific Rim. Of course, Douglas always did have expensive tastes that he kept quiet about. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror that evening. 63, grey-haired, reading glasses on a chain around my neck. I looked like exactly what I was, a retired school board administrator from Halifax, who had driven carpool and packed lunches and attended every single one of her children's school concerts, and never once asked for very much in return. I did not look like someone Douglas's colleagues would remember seeing. That was the plan. I wore my navy blazer, the one I used to wear to year-end staff meetings. I pulled my hair back more severely than I usually do. I borrowed a name tag holder lanyard from the hotel's conference room supply box. They left them in a basket near the business centre, and I printed a generic name on a slip of paper and slid it in. I'm not proud of this, but I needed to walk through a hotel ballroom without being escorted out, and sometimes practicality overrides pride. The gala started at 7. I arrived at 6:45. The Pacific Rim's ballroom is the kind of room that makes you feel slightly underdressed, no matter what you're wearing. High ceilings, soft gold lighting, enormous windows looking out over Burrard Inlet. The mountains were finally visible, lit faintly by the last of the evening sky. I walked in with a group of people who were clearly also arriving, stayed near the edges of the cluster, and by the time anyone might have wondered who I was already inside. I found a spot near the bar on the far side of the room. Not at the bar, beside it, slightly behind a column where I had a clear view of the entrance and most of the floor. I asked the bartender for a sparkling water with lime. I held it like a glass of wine. I waited. Douglas arrived at 7:12. I would know him in any room in the world. Even now, even after all of it, there is something about the way he moves, that particular combination of deliberateness and restraint that I've watched for nearly 4 decades, that makes him instantly recognizable to me. He was wearing his charcoal suit, the good one, and his silver tie. He looked tired and proud and slightly nervous, the way he always looks when something matters to him. He was not alone. There was a woman beside him. Young, well, young to me, meaning somewhere in her 30s. Dark hair, professional look, a tablet under her arm. She was speaking to him quietly as they walked, and he was nodding, listening carefully. She handed him something, a card or a small envelope, and then peeled off toward a table near the front where a few other people in similar blazers were gathered. My jaw was tight. My hands were steady. I watched. Douglas circulated the room. He shook hands. He laughed at things people said. He accepted a glass of red wine and barely touched it, the way he does when he's trying to stay sharp. I watched him for 40 minutes, and in those 40 minutes he was warm and gracious and present in a way that I sometimes wished he would be at home. And then I saw it. He was standing near the window with 2 colleagues, both men I recognized from the firm's website, and the young woman came back over. She leaned in close and said something, and Douglas glanced down at his phone and then across the room, not at me, he couldn't see me, but toward the entrance. His expression changed. Something in it shifted from careful composure into something softer, something almost private. He excused himself. He followed her toward a side corridor near the event staff doors. I set my sparkling water on the edge of the bar. I followed them. The corridor was narrow and fluorescent lit, a service hallway behind the ballroom. I stopped just inside the door, staying close to the wall. Douglas and the young woman were standing perhaps 20 feet away, their voices low. I could hear them, but only in fragments. Names, logistics, timing. Then I heard my name. He said it the way he has always said it, quietly, like it's not for public use. My name in Douglas's voice sounds different than my name anywhere else. I've never been able to explain that to anyone, he said. She has absolutely no idea. And then he laughed. A real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere genuine. I pressed my back against the wall and I breathed very carefully and I waited. The young woman said something about the ferry, about the morning of the 14th, about a booking at a place called Souk Harbour House on the south tip of Vancouver Island, which I would find out later is one of the most beautiful inn and restaurant properties on the entire west coast of Canada, about a couple's package that included 3 nights and a private dinner on the water, about a bracelet she'd helped him pick out at a jewellery on Granville Island 2 days ago. White gold, she said, with the small sapphire, because it matched the earrings I'd worn on our wedding day. I stopped breathing entirely. Douglas said, she wore those earrings every anniversary for 20 years. Did you know that? I noticed and I never told her. The young woman, his assistant, I understood now, a detail he had never particularly shared with me, because Douglas compartmentalizes everything. Work is work, and home is home, and he has always been this way, said that was. And I am quoting exactly because I've not forgotten a single word of that hallway, the most quietly romantic thing I've ever heard. I left before they came back out. I walked back through the ballroom. I nodded at the bartender. I went out through the main entrance and I stood on the sidewalk on Canada Place Way in the November rain, and I cried. Not sad crying, the kind that comes from realizing you've been holding your breath for something that turned out to be fine. The kind that comes from loving someone for 38 years and watching them do something like that in a service corridor when they think no one is watching. I had not taken a single photograph. I had not confronted anyone. I had flown across the country in sensible shoes and found my husband planning a surprise I didn't deserve to know about yet. I called our daughter that night from my hotel room. She answered on the second ring and said, "Mom, why are you calling from a Vancouver number?" "I need to tell you something," I said. There was a pause. "Should I be worried?" "No," I said. "Actually, I think you should laugh." I told her everything, about the boarding pass, about the lanyard, about pressing myself against a service corridor wall like a 63-year-old woman in a spy film, about hearing my name in Douglas's voice in a fluorescent-lit hallway 3,000 kilometers from home. My daughter was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in the exact tone she has had since she was 14, slightly exasperated and deeply affectionate, "Mom, oh my God. Dad is going to lose his mind when he finds out." "He is never finding out," I said. "Mom." "He is never finding out," I repeated. I owned this surprise fair and square. She laughed so hard I had to hold the phone away from my ear. I flew home the next morning. I was back in Halifax before Douglas's return flight from what had officially been a conference in Ottawa. I made his favourite dinner, roast chicken with the herb crust he likes, the kind I only make when something feels worth celebrating. I set the table in the dining room instead of the kitchen. When he came through the door, he looked surprised in that quiet way of his and said, "What's all this?" "Nothing," I said. "I just felt like it." He kissed me on the cheek and went to wash his hands, and when he came back to the table and sat across from me, he looked the way he has looked for 38 years, steady, a little tired, difficult to read on the surface and perfectly legible once you know how. I looked at him over the dinner I had made, and I thought about a jewellery on Granville Island and a small sapphire and a hallway where he said my name, the way he always says it. I did not say a word. 10 days later, he came into the kitchen on a Sunday morning with a cup of coffee and a slightly too casual expression that I have learned, over nearly 4 decades, to recognise immediately. "So," he said. "So," I said. "I was thinking we could take a trip." He cleared his throat. "There's a place on Vancouver Island, an inn. I thought we could do a few days, just us." I looked up from my book. "Vancouver Island," I said. "Silk area. I read about it. Supposed to be beautiful." He put his coffee down. "We haven't really had a trip, just the two of us, in a while." I let him stand there for a moment. Just a moment. I thought about a boarding pass on a front hall table and a 63-year-old woman with a lanyard and a sparkling water with lime and a service corridor where the most important thing she would ever overhear was her own name said quietly by the person who had been saying it for 38 years. "I'd love that," I said. He smiled. That rare, real smile, the one that hasn't changed since the night we met at a faculty mixer in 1986 when I was 25 and he spilled red wine on my sleeve and apologised for so long that I finally had to tell him it was fine just to make him stop. "Good," he said. He picked up his coffee. "I'll make the booking today." I went back to my book. Outside the kitchen window, the maple in our backyard had gone red and gold, the way it does every October, the way it has done every October. The way it has done every October for as long as we have lived in this house. The coffee maker clicked off. Douglas's chair scraped back, and I heard him moving through the house the way I have heard him for 38 years, familiar as breathing, unremarkable and irreplaceable all at once. Some things you don't have to say. Some things you just carry quietly. The way he carried my name in a lit hallway. The way I carried a boarding pass in a front hall. And somewhere between all the silence and the small ordinary moments, you find out that you've been building the same thing all along. You just weren't always watching at the same time. That November on Vancouver Island, we sat at a table by the water and he put a white gold bracelet with a small sapphire around my wrist, and I acted surprised, and I was not surprised at all, and it was absolutely perfect. I've thought a lot about what made me get on that plane. Not the boarding pass itself, That was just paper. It was the 38 years behind it, the weight of them. When you've spent that long building a life with someone, you develop a kind of knowing that doesn't come from logic. It comes from paying attention, from showing up, even when showing up is quiet and unremarkable and no one notices you doing it. That's what I keep coming back to, the showing up. I could have confronted Douglas the moment I found that boarding pass. I could have accused him of something, built a case out of one slim piece of paper and a lot of fear. Fear is fast. It moves quickly and it feels like certainty, and it will absolutely convince you that you already know the ending before you've read the middle. I've watched it do that to people I love. I felt it try to do it to me. But I chose something harder than fear. I chose to go and find out for myself. Not to catch him, though I won't pretend that wasn't somewhere in the back of my mind. To know. There's a difference. Knowing requires patience and a willingness to be wrong about what you thought you already knew. It requires the kind of clear-headedness that doesn't come easily when you're standing in a front hallway holding evidence of a secret, your heart doing something uncomfortable in your chest. I had to make myself slow down. I had to think before I reacted. That steadiness, the ability to pause between the feeling and the action, is something I've had to practice my entire life. It doesn't come naturally to anyone, but it is the difference, most of the time, between making things worse and finding out the truth. And the truth, in that fluorescent lit corridor at the Fairmont Pacific Rim, was a husband who had been quietly noticing my earrings for 20 years and never said so out loud. We don't talk enough about the kind of courage it takes to stay in something, to keep choosing the same person through all the ordinary difficult years. Douglas and I have not had a perfect marriage. We have had a real one, which is considerably more complicated and considerably more valuable. He is not naturally expressive. I have not always been naturally patient. We have missed each other sometimes, talked past each other, been in the same room and somehow not quite there together. Marriage, over decades, is like that. It goes in and out of focus. What I learned in that hallway is that he had been focusing the whole time, quietly, privately, in the way that is most essentially him. He noticed, he remembered, he made a plan, and I, in the most essentially me way possible, booked a same-day flight on Aeroplan points and flew 3,000 kilometres to find that out. There is something in that symmetry that I find genuinely funny, even now. What I want to say to anyone who is somewhere in the middle of a long marriage and feeling the particular loneliness of being unseen is this: pay attention before you conclude. The people we love are often doing something we haven't noticed yet, and the discipline to look before you decide, to act from honesty rather than fear, to keep showing up even when you're uncertain, that is not a small thing. That is, I think, most of what love actually is, once you strip away everything else. I wore the bracelet home on the plane from Vancouver Island. Douglas didn't ask how it caught the light the way it did. He just held my hand at the window as the mountains disappeared into cloud below us. I let him think he'd surprised me completely. Some things are better kept.